Hello everyone, I'm Pieter from Ghent University, and this is my presentation reading Karl Polanyi in the 21st century. Now, since the 80s we have seen a renaissance of Karl Polanyi's oeuvre. In this talk I would like to point to a danger of interpreting the current neoliberal order as a similar trend towards marketization, as in the period that Polanyi is dealing with in his book The Great Transformation. Misinterpreting the current marketization project raises questions about the feasibility of re-embedding economy back into society. Whereas the initial marketization project of the 19th century entailed a stark utopia, I argue that this utopian character shifted to counter-movements in their attempt to resist disembedding and the attempt to re-embed economy back into society. But let's focus first on the reason why a lot of researchers turn to Polanyi. This has to do with the assumption, the idea that what we are seeing nowadays is quite compatible with the time frame Polanyi was studying. Although Polanyi was convinced that the experience of the 30s meant the official end of ideas of free marketeers, from the 70s onwards we have seen the emergence of a neoliberal order. Neoliberalism is known for its many definitions and interpretations, and one of its interpretations is known as the so-called classical perspective on neoliberalism. And this perspective entails a literal interpretation of neo. It is understood as a return to the project of economic liberalism of the 19th century. Although it is true that this version has already been depicted as problematic, it is remarkable that this interpretation of the return to the project of economic liberalism is quite present in writings and debates relying on Polanyi's oeuvre. One of the reasons for this is related to the use of the embedded-disembedded opposition as a tool to understand the current political economic order. Important to notice is that there is a lot of discussion and critique about the ambiguous use of this distinction in Polanyi's work. I can't deal with all these critiques in this short talk. But suffice to say is that I use the opposition embedding-disembedding in the study of capitalism as a historically specific but evolving system, with a particular interest in the last 25-30 years. Now, in this context, the meaning of Polanyi's distinction entails a description of transformation towards a capitalist order, whereas in preceding systems, the economy was embedded in social, political, religious relationships. In the transformation towards the self-regulating market system of industrial capitalism, Polanyi detected a tendency in which the economy became disembedded from society. But in the Great Transformation, the central thesis Polanyi develops is the idea that the self-adjusting market, or the self-regulating market, implied a stark utopia. Why? The first element is that the market economy can only exist in the market society. The formula of classical liberalism was, in the context of a mercantile intervening state with unlimited regulations in the market, let us establish a space of economic freedom. As such, the natural laws of the market are liberated, and as a consequence the market evolves into a site of jurisdiction. In this version, laissez-faire is not an instrument, it is the thing to be achieved. According to Fred Bloch, Polanyi describes this as the attempt by the classical economists to create a society in which the economy has been effectively embedded, instead of being embedded in social relations. So the project of disembedding means that only such policies and measures are in order which help to ensure the self-regulation of the market by creating the conditions that make the market the only organizing power in the economic sphere. So, according to Polanyi, the attempt to create a separate economic system in society where politics would no longer intervene. However, the creation of the market as the only organizing power in the economic sphere is not enough in order to sustain a market economy, because self-regulation also implies that all production is for sale on the market and that all income derived from such sales. So in other words, a market economy must comprise all elements of industry, including land, labor and money. But these three things are, according to Polanyi, so-called fictitious commodities. They are not produced to be sold on the market, and to include them in the market mechanism means to subordinate the substance of society itself to the laws of the market. Now, classical economists believe that these fictitious commodities would behave in the same way as real commodities do. Polanyi argues that this led to fatal consequences, because humans will behave differently. Society is not a blank slate. Society will resist. And it is at this point that Polanyi argues that market societies are constituted by two opposing movements. On the one hand, the laissez-faire movement, to expand the scope of the market, and on the other hand, the protective counter-movement, that emerges to resist the disembedding of the economy. So the reason for this counter-movement to emerge was merely protective in scope, but more importantly, as a result of this counter-movement, disembedding the economy entails an utopian project. Now, whereas after the crash of 1929, and in particular after the end of World War II, the economy was subject of a process of re-embedding into society, the return to marketization processes since the 70s is seen as a renewed attempt to disembed the market from society/politics. And this renewed attempt is grasped by some academics as a swing of a pendulum. And this turn seems to lead to exactly the same consequences, results as the project of economic liberalism in the 19th century. Economic crisis and levels of inequality that are quite comparable with the situation at the end of the 19th century. And also the rise of progressive and regressive counter-movements, especially in the context of the crash of 2008, resisting this process of disembedding. Now, just as Polanyi did in his book, I would like to introduce a conundrum. How can we explain the robustness of neoliberal capitalism, considering its alleged loss of hegemony after the crisis of 2008, and with the rise of counter-movements worldwide, who are trying to resist this process of disembedding? This could sound for many as contradictory, and some would even argue that it is still too early to say that neoliberalism has survived its crisis. When Zhu Enlai was asked about his opinion concerning the French Revolution, he answered, "Is it not a little too early for a definitive answer? But let us at least try to provide a provisional answer. Why did the pendulum not swing to the other side after the crisis of 2008? The entry point of my argument is the remark made by the Polanyian economist Michel Cangiani. The history of capitalism cannot be reduced to a mechanical oscillation from a less to a more embedded economy, and vice versa, is her argument. In particular, similarities between the current neoliberal phase and 19th century liberalism are less interesting than differences, is the argument of Michel Cangiani. Now, I argue that there is indeed an important difference between the phase Polanyi was studying and the current neoliberal order. And this difference has a huge impact on the capacity for counter-movements in their attempt to resist the process of disembedding and to re-embed economy back into society. And to understand this difference, we need to focus on the notion of disembedding. We already defined the notion of disembedding as a process of institutional separation. The notion of disembedding entails the idea that the market is the only organizing power in the economic sphere. The attempt in the 19th century to keep the economic, political and social spheres institutionally separated indeed failed. But it did not fail because of the counter-movement resisted this tendency of disembedding, because the counter-movement reacted to something different. It's more nuanced. The initial attempt to create a separate economic order in society produced spillover effects in society, in which social relations, through the three fictitious commodities, became embedded in that economic logic. This outcome, or better tendency, was something that the classical liberals in the strategy or in their ideology had not reflected on too deeply. the fictitious commodities did not behave as commodities, because in society the natural laws of the market are not in place. It's a complete illusion. And this entails the paradox of disembedding. Disembedding the economy from society leads to embedding the latter into the former. And the reaction, or better resistance, was focused on the so-called spillover effects of market disembedding that entailed the embedding of society into the economy. If we look to the neoliberal revolution in the 20th century, we have to remark that this did not only entail a renewed project of disembedding. The innovation of neoliberalism is situated in the transformation of the spillover effect into the key of the entire project. And if we look to the neoliberal ideology or governmentality or neoliberalism tout court, we detect two main distinctive points. First, the redefinition of the relationship between state, society and the economy. Neoliberal theory does not fail to recognize the notion or even inevitability of embeddedness. It entails a deliberate attempt to embed society into the economy. Neoliberalism is characterized with this redefinition of the relationship between economy, state, society. It is not about creating different spheres. Neoliberalism removes, in a sense, the limiting external principle of the state and puts a regulatory and inner principle in its place. It is the market form which serves as the organizational principle, not only for the economy, but for state and society and the economy. And in relation to the latter, it is the deliberate attempt which brings us to the second element, the nature of the intervention. The entry point is the rejection that the market does amount to natural economic reality, with intrinsic laws that governments must bear in mind and respect by not intervening after they have liberated that logic. Therefore, interventionism in neoliberalism is focused on the creation of that logic, of the assumptions that in the previous model were taken for granted, and where interventionism was only directed in order to liberate that logic. So in the context of the first element, this means that interventionism takes a very radical character. The deliberate attempt to embed society into the economy, and not just as a mere spillover effect, is the main characteristic of neoliberalism. And also the active production, creation of an economic logic that needs to be implemented constantly and everywhere. These elements were very central when you study the texts of the so-called neoliberal thought collective. So neoliberal theories entailed clearly this idea of the deliberate attempt of embedding society into the economy. But the fuel of this engine should not be searched in the superstructure, if you want, looking which actors influenced who, but it should be found in a specific epistemological calculative tool that we all know, which is GDP. The modern concept of GDP was developed by Kuznets for a US Congress report in 1934, but it was only after the Bretton Woods Conference that GDP became the main tool for measuring a country's economy. And it is the moment that progress became measured, calculated. But GDP is more than just a measure. If it is true that the goals we articulate are inevitably reflected in the measures we use, then we could also argue that a mere indicator gives direction towards we should go. So if commodification was already a defining process of capitalism, now we started to measure it, and as a consequence it locked us in. So the experienced robustness of the current marketization process, depicted by many as neoliberal, is found in the idea of proactively embedding society in your economic logic, but the concrete tool that made this possible, compulsory, was GDP. So the search for growth became tangible and compulsory the moment it was linked to this epistemological calculative tool. More growth means more products and services to be produced and bought on a market, but also more aspects of life needed to be turned into commodities. And this explains the dominant logic behind the current process of marketization. It is contaminating all spheres of society. Nevertheless, something else that became linked to the logic of growth became even more important in the process of embedding society into an economic realm or logic, which is debt. And although it was already a trend after the 50s, debt became the most important fuel of economic growth. Debt has grown, in particular linked to financialization, in which it became an asset on its own, and urbanization, in the so-called second circuit of capital, in such a way that everything around us is absorbed by its logic. Think of the financialization of our debts, our houses, our pensions, and so forth. The whole recourse to financialization is indeed driven to stimulate demand by means of ever-increasing debts in such a way that it absorbs society. So the process in which society becomes more and more embedded into economy is an ongoing process, and as such becomes more and more a reality. Not because of the genius of one group, but because it became linked to an epistemological instrument, even if it was intrinsically already present, and therefore became translated into reality and started to change reality more and more according to its logic. So the growth-debt constellation functions as a black hole that is absorbing society entirely into its logic, and not as a spillover effect, but as the main effect. So against this background, the answer to the question, why did the pendulum not swing to the other side, towards a process of re-embedding, driven by a counter-movement, is that the pendulum never swung in the direction of an economy separated from society in the classical sense of disembeddedness. The attempt by actors of the counter-movement to re-embed economy back into society appears to be obsolete, because what does it mean to re-embed economy into society in the context of a locked-in process of constant embedding of the latter into the former? Which brings us to the key argument I'm currently developing. The project or attempt to re-embed economy back into society entails an utopian project. And the utopian character is situated in the aim of re-embedding, because the prefix re refers to a return to a previous situation that is impossible to reach, because after decades of neoliberal globalization and in the context of the GDP debt constellation, the nature and scope of society has changed so that you can't go back, because society in which the economy was once embedded is not there anymore. But before you can, so you need to reinvent society, but before you can do that, you need to do something else. You need to do something about the growth debt constellation. And the two classical methods of re-embedding are not suited to be very successful in this task. First, you have the moderate variant of re-embedding, which entails the regulation of the market system to prevent its immediate destructive character. But according to some, this never really meant a real embedding or re-embedding, because you do not dissolve the commodity status of land, labor and money. And some academics, also Polanyi, argued that such interference with the market leads to the impairment of the market system itself and creates tensions, leading to another kind of catastrophe. On the other hand, the radical variant of re-embedding is also a kind of an illusion, and the radical variant entails the complete subjugation of the markets, in which two elements are important and closely interlinked: decommodification of the fictitious commodities and the reassertion of social control over the markets, also known as the democratization of the markets. But both elements rely in the proper use of the instrument of the state to bring the market logic under its supervision or its complete subordination. But the state itself has evolved into an instrument to safeguard the growth debt constellation. Now, to conclude, a short reflection note on the political project of democracy as an engine of change, because despite a rather pessimistic outline, I do not abandon the project of democracy. But I do believe that, relying on what Mouvan Leclau once wrote, if the alternative of the left consists in the field of a democratic revolution, this revolution can't be focused on the articulation of a new hegemony, because the robustness of the current neoliberal capitalist order is not situated in the notion of hegemony but of calculability. The democratic instrument can only be successful as a game changer if the alternatives it produces are framed in a new form of calculability.